Okay, welcome back. So now we're ready to get started in getting our specific VM ready to go. Alright, so I have a few things open on my system right now. The first is the GitHub app that we downloaded previously. Now this is the Mac version, and it does look very different on the Windows version. So for the folks that are using Windows, you'll have to kind of interpret this a little bit in your system, but the functionality should be the same. I also have a web browser here in the background. We'll come back to this in a minute, and then also a terminal session or command prompt if you're on Windows. Okay, so after you send me your username, your GitHub username, I would have sent you back a link to this private repository on GitHub. It's private because we have some unique configuration files here that are specific to what we're doing at Notre Dame, and we just don't need to share those with everybody else in the world. So what you want to do is you want to come to this page. So icon omega is my GitHub username, and then this is the name of the private repo. There's another repo that we're going to be using that's just called ND Technology Bakeoff, and that is public and does different things. So make sure that you're right here with the starter repo. Then what you're going to do is click this clone button. This will obviously, on your system, if you're using a Windows system, it'll say clone in PC, or if you're using Linux, it'll say something to the effect of cloning Linux. So you go ahead and click that, and it's going to try to launch the GitHub application. I'll go ahead and say yes. Now what it's doing on my system is it's asking me where I want to put this. Now I'm not sure if the Windows system asks you where it wants you to put it, or if it just puts it someplace for you. It doesn't ultimately matter. You'll just have to know where it ends up in the end. So I'm going to put it in the projects folder that I have here, and I'm going to just leave it called, sure, ND Technology Bakeoff Starter. Hit clone. And you can see here that it's progressing pretty slowly, I guess. Okay, so there it goes. I'm not sure what the hiccup was with that, but it's done now. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to use Vagrant for the first time. How exciting. So over here in my terminal session, I'm going to go to the directory that is in. So this is where I put that. Now again, on your system it could be a different location, so you're just going to have to find the location that's yours. Let's see here. Now, some of these files here, let's explain what these do. This file here, Vagrant file, that's actually what Vagrant uses to control the configuration and the provisioning of the development VM that we'll be using. Since we all have the same Vagrant file, we'll all have the same development VM, which is what makes Vagrant great for working with teams on a project. These different files here, Oracle Bootstrap, Python Bootstrap, and Ruby Bootstrap, are called by the Vagrant file to do some of its work inside the VM. This one right here, we're actually going to run inside the VM after it boots up. So to create your VM, you simply do Vagrant up. What that does is it looks at the Vagrant file and then starts its work. Now you can see here that on my screen the progress is going fairly quickly. This is because I've already had VMs that use the same base OS installed on my machine. So it doesn't have to go and get that base OS image again. If this is the first time you've used Vagrant, or the first time you've used an Ubuntu-based virtual machine, it's going to take, it's going to have to go out and get that base OS image, which can take a little while depending on your internet connection speed. So you may just have to wait a while. Just be patient; it'll come around. What you can see here is that after the VM is booted, it's going through and doing some package maintenance to make sure that everything is updated on the system. Then it's going to start installing the Oracle client stuff, which is what it's doing now. It appears in red, but that doesn't mean that anything's going wrong necessarily. It's just how the status message comes through on Vagrant. So this file takes a long time to load. So I'm going to actually cut out a good portion of the video while this is just loading. So we will come back to the video after this has kind of done its thing. Okay, so here we are back again, picking up when it's finishing doing the Oracle download. The Oracle downloads take forever, so you can go and get a drink of coffee or something and then come back. So here we go, finishing up. Alright, so it did that. Now it's basically installing and configuring that Oracle stuff, and then it's going to move on to doing the Python and Ruby Bootstrap files, which won't take nearly as long. And then when it's all said and done, it will return you to the prompt, and at which point we can then SSH into our virtual machine. Finished running the Vagrant up command, and everything's been set up, so now we can SSH into the machine and do the final configuration steps. Now, as a reminder, if you're on Windows, you're going to need PuTTY at this point to be able to SSH into your machine. But if you're on a Unix-based system, you simply run this command, vagrant SSH, and you'll see that your prompt right here will change to this, which basically means, if you're unfamiliar with working at the terminal, you're logged in as the user Vagrant on the machine identified as Precise64. So if you do, you're going to want to go to a directory called Vagrant. Now in here, you'll notice that the same files are listed in this directory right here as are in the ND Technology Bakeoff starter directory on your home or your host machine. This is kind of where the magic of Vagrant comes in, is it maps this /Vagrant folder back to your host machine so that you can edit files directly on your host, but they live inside of the VM. Where this comes in super handy is that you'll use your tools that you like on your host machine, with your IDE or whatnot, and yet be able to have your separate environment that is safe and clearly demarcated from your host system. All right. Anyways, so we're in here now, and there's one final configuration file that we have to run, and it's this right here: Github Bootstrap run inside VM. What that's going to do is it's going to pull down a fork of a repository that you're going to need. Now, obviously, you don't have that fork yet, so let's make a trip back out to GitHub, and we'll find it. So here again is GitHub, and this is the one we used previously. Now that is not the one we're going to use. Instead, we're going to use a different one. So the first thing you're going to do is do a search for my username, which is that. What it's going to come back with, is this right here. You want to click on this little user icon, and it's going to bring up my account. Go ahead and click on that. Then go to repositories. And then the top one here, ND Technology Bakeoff. That's what you want. Select that. And then you're going to hit this button right here called fork. When it comes to Git, what fork does is it makes a copy of this repository just for you, so that each developer that has a fork of this is going to have a complete copy of the repository local on their machine. So when you do your commits, updates, or whatever, you're doing them to your copy, not to somebody else's copy. So that keeps everything nice and separated, but it also gives you individual source control. Later on at the end of the project, we can do something called pulling, which is we'll pull code in from the various forks into the main branch if we want to do that for documentation purposes or just having a record of what we all accomplished together. Alright, so after you do that, then you can come back to your terminal and run this command. This is how you'll do it. Sudo, which means run as root, Python, which you're invoking the Python interpreter because this is a Python file, and then the file name. Hit enter. It's going to install Git for you if you don't already have it on the machine, which you won't because we just made it. And then after it finishes that, it's going to ask you for two things. The first is your GitHub account username, and the second is your GitHub is the email associated with your GitHub account. It needs that to be able to know what fork to go get, and also to help you with various other configuration settings when you're trying to push things back up into GitHub. So in my case, there's my username, right? And here's my email. So you can see here that it is cloning that fork down into my folder. Now I've directed it to give it this name, so everybody will have this same name for this repository, ND Technology Bakeoff code, as opposed to ND Technology Bakeoff starter. So the code directory is where all the code lives for what we're going to be doing. You can see here that it's finishing up here, and this may take a little longer or a little less long, depending on your internet connection and the processor speed that you have here. You can see that it's retrieved everything, and now it's kind of doing some internal processing on the files themselves. Okay, so we are done with that. So now if you do another ls command, which just means list the contents of the directory, basically, you can see here that we have a new folder in here called ND Technology Bakeoff code. We're going to go in there so you can see what is included. You can see here that we have a Python and a Ruby directory. The readme.md is just a file that is used for GitHub's purposes. You can just ignore that. Inside of both the Python and Ruby directories, you'll see three subdirectories which correspond to the three scenarios that we have to test for the Bakeoff. Inside of each of these directories, you'll find one more directory for the Python ones, which is what we're doing first, called venv. What is contained in that directory is a unique Python environment just for that particular scenario. The reason that we will do that is because you may find that you want to install unique third-party packages for any particular scenario. And you want to, generally when you're doing Python development, you want to keep these things separate on a per project basis so that you don't have conflicts or versioning issues with these third-party tools that you might be using. So if you come back out into Ruby, you can see that we have the three scenarios there as well. Now the last thing to note here is if you bring up a new terminal window, you can now see that that folder, which we got, is now available on your host machine as well. So again, just going back to the earlier point, these folders are shared. You can access them directly on the VM if you want to, or from your host machine. All right, well, you are ready to get started. Good luck and have fun.